Hey guys! Tonight we begin with something special, drifting into a world most of us never think about. The unseen labour that shaped life and death itself. For the next few minutes, we're going to explore the absolute worst jobs in history, the kinds of work so grim and relentless that just imagining them is enough to make your eyelids heavy. Before we step into tonight's story, take a second to like this video and subscribe, so these mysteries can reach others in your family too. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see where you're tuning in from, almost like tiny lights glowing on a map across the world. The world above was always busy, merchants crying out, bells tolling, children laughing in the narrow streets. But beneath it, in the shadow of churchyards and fields scattered with stone markers, there worked men who did not belong to the rhythm of daylight. They belonged to silence. They belonged to the earth. They belonged to the grave. In medieval Europe, death was everywhere, always close at hand. Illness carried off the young, wars left villages stripped of fathers and sons, famine thinned entire generations, and with every loss came the same quiet, necessary labour. Someone had to carve open the soil. Someone had to lower bodies into it. Someone had to close the earth again. The gravedigger was not a man remembered by name. He was remembered by the sound of his shovel, the clink of iron against stone, the sigh of dirt falling back into the pit. The work was heavy in a way that gnawed at bones. 6 feet down was not a saying, it was a measure. Clay resisted the blade. Roots tangled in the spade's path. The body, wrapped in rough cloth or lowered in pine, waited above while sweat ran down the worker's back. No ceremony for him. The priest intoned blessings for the dead, but the man who made room for that dead stood apart, mud on his hands, his breathing ragged, his face turned from the mourners. He was a figure, necessary, but unwanted. Invited to labour, but not to grieve. The worst of it was not the toil of digging. It was the company he kept. For the gravedigger lived among rot. When plague came, there was no pause, no rest. Bells rang endlessly, tolling death after death, and men like him dug until their hands blistered and bled. Bodies piled higher than the shovels could clear. When the Black Death swept through Europe, the graveyards filled faster than they could be carved open. Sometimes pits were made wide and long, dozens of corpses lowered together, layered with lime to hasten the decay. The gravedigger would stand, panting, above a trench of neighbours and strangers, their faces already grey, and know tomorrow he might join them. And yet he returned. He had to. It was his job. He was paid little, sometimes in bread, sometimes in a few coins, sometimes in nothing at all but the guarantee of his own place in consecrated ground when the time came. That was payment enough, some thought, the promise that he would not be left to rot above the earth like a beggar or criminal. The air of the churchyard was thick with smells others avoided, damp soil, old flowers, the faint sweetness of decay that clung even when the grave was filled. To dig there was to be marked by it. People noticed the dirt beneath his nails, the scent that clung to his clothes. Children stepped aside. Women crossed themselves. And still, someone had to do it. For the living to rest, the dead must first be hidden. Gravediggers learned to work in silence. They moved with the patience of men who knew no one was watching. The shovel rose, the shovel fell. Sometimes, if the ground was rocky, they struck against stone until sparks flew. If it was winter, the earth was frozen solid, iron bouncing off like it had struck a wall. Men were sent for hammers and picks, and the hours stretched as the corpse stiffened beside them. The mourners shivered, waiting. The diggers pressed on, breath clouding in the air. There were nights when the grave could not wait. Lanterns bobbed in the dark, throwing long shadows as shovels cut into the earth by candlelight. The village slept, but in the churchyard there was no sleep. Only the slow widening of a hole meant to cradle someone forever. The gravedigger worked in rhythm with the night creatures, the owls, the bats, the rustling rats. It was not uncommon for him to uncover bones of older burials. Earth was reused. Plots were not always as eternal as promised. A spade would strike against something that was not stone, but brittle ivory. The hollow grin of a skull appeared where soil was expected. Then the digger had to choose, set the bones aside respectfully, or toss them further down. In plague times, there was no choice at all. Bones were swept aside, crushed, mixed into the soil to make room for the next. The gravedigger's hands knew textures, the heavy cling of clay, the soft crumble of loam, the unnerving give of fabric-wrapped flesh. Sometimes graves collapsed, walls sliding inward. Sometimes water pooled at the bottom, turning the pit into a mirror that reflected lantern light. Always there was the pressure of time, the watching eyes of the living waiting to see their dead swallowed by earth. And yet, strangely, these men were not always despised. Fear clung to them, yes, but also a hint of reverence. They stood close to the edge of life and death, a liminal place most dared not linger. Priests prayed, but gravediggers acted. Their spades opened the final door. In whispers, some believed they carried knowledge of death itself. That constant contact with the departed gave them a kind of grim wisdom. Others, more suspicious, said the gravedigger was touched by misfortune, cursed to carry the weight of other people's endings. Children dared each other to speak with them. Some villagers swore they saw gravediggers eating near the stones, perched on fresh mounds, as if keeping company with those newly buried. They drank strong ale, sometimes in silence, sometimes with a hollow laugh, mud still caked on their boots. Who else could eat after a day like that? Who else could sleep with the memory of open coffins, the sound of soil pattering against wood? But the truth was simple. They were men who had no choice. Poverty pushed them beneath the stones. Few were born to the task. Most arrived there after other paths closed. A farmer ruined by crop failure. A soldier too injured to fight again. A debtor seeking any wage at all. The graveyard became their workshop. Tools wore down quickly. Spades snapped. Picks bent. The parish did not pay for new ones readily, so diggers often mended their tools themselves or worked with them broken. Their clothes frayed, patched again and again until fabric gave way entirely. And always they worked in mud, in cold, in stench. One can imagine their hands, thick with calluses, nails cracked and blackened. Their eyes tired but sharp enough to see the smallest root to cut. Their backs bent from years of hauling earth. These were not men who walked proudly through town squares. They slipped along the edges, known but avoided, needed but unwelcomed. And yet without them, the dead would linger above ground. Without them, mourning could not finish. Without them, the cycle of life and death that ruled every community would break. Their invisibility was their curse, but also their strange importance. When plague swept deepest, the gravedigger's role became a nightmare. Some dug until they fell. Their bodies added to the very pits they carved. Some grew numb, shoveling without looking at faces, only seeing shapes beneath shrouds. Some whispered prayers under their breath, faster than any priest, desperate to keep death at bay. And some, hardened by endless exposure, stopped praying altogether. They simply dug. Think of the stillness after such work. When the last clod of earth was tamped down, when the mourners drifted home, when the lantern was snuffed out, The gravedigger stood alone in the churchyard. Rows of stones stretched away into the dark. He had touched them all, dug for them all, left pieces of himself in each mound of earth. Above ground, the world slept. Beneath the stones his labour lingered, and tomorrow more would come. The earth could close itself over the dead, but the living carried their own burden, waste, filth, the endless outpouring of bodies that ate, drank, and left behind what no one wished to claim. Cities swelled with people pressed shoulder to shoulder, and beneath their feet ran the hidden streams of human refuse. Latrines filled, privies overflowed, and when darkness settled over the rooftops, another kind of worker slipped quietly into the silence. He was called the gong farmer. Gong, an old word for dung. A farmer, though no crops grew from his toil. His harvest was the waste of thousands. By day, no one wished to see him. By night, his lantern swung low through the narrow streets as he sought out cesspits waiting to be emptied. These pits were dug behind homes, beneath taverns, even under monasteries. Holes lined with stone or wood, into which generations had poured what they could not keep. At first, a pit might serve well enough, swallowing the leavings of families and guests. But slowly, inevitably, it filled. The stench began to creep up through cracks in the floorboards. Flies swarmed. Rats gnawed their way into the feast. Then someone would mutter the name of the gong farmer. He arrived when others slept. His tools were simple: a long-handled shovel, wooden buckets bound with iron, ropes and pulleys for lowering and raising, and sometimes nothing more than his hands, wrapped in ragged cloth. He lowered himself into the pit, his lantern left above, and the night swallowed him. Inside was darkness thick as tar. The air was heavy, sour, clinging to skin and hair. Every breath risked faintness, for the gases of rot rose from below. The farmer worked slowly, scooping, lifting, passing the filled buckets up to his companions, who emptied them into carts waiting under moonlight. The cart itself was a horror, slopping with the night's collection, wheels squealing as it made its way toward the edges of the town. There the waste was dumped, sometimes in fields, sometimes into rivers, sometimes spread upon land that would, in cruel irony, later grow food. The labour was endless. Cities never stopped producing more. A tavern's cesspit might need emptying every few months. A monastery, fed by dozens of monks and their guests, filled quickly. And the larger towns, London, Paris, Cologne, were great machines of filth, their gong farmers busy every night, moving from house to house, hole to hole, shovelling humanity's shadow. Few spoke to them. They carried a stench that no washing could scrub away. Clothes clung to it, hair absorbed it, skin seemed soaked in it. Even in daylight, when their carts rolled out of town, people pinched their noses and spat as they passed. Children ran, half laughing, half afraid. Women turned their faces aside. But the gong farmer endured it, because his work, despised though it was, paid better than many honest trades. Coin clinked into his palm, heavier than what a field labourer earned, more reliable than a weaver's wage. He was shunned, but he was not starving. And in a world where so many lived, always a step away from hunger, that mattered. Still, the danger was constant. To descend into a cesspit was to gamble with breath. There were stories of farmers overcome in an instant, lungs seized by foul air. Some were pulled up limp, their bodies reeking, their faces blue. Others never rose at all, buried not in soil like the gravedigger's charges, but in the slurry of the living. Those who survived learned to test the air first, lowering a candle, watching how the flame danced or died. A flicker meant danger. A quick snuff meant death waiting below. But work had to be done. Even when the flame died, men climbed down. They moved with practiced rhythm, shoveling until their arms burned, pausing only to cough or wipe at their eyes. The waste clung to everything. It splashed, spattered, soaked through boots. Rags tied around mouths offered little protection. And always there was the weight of knowing. One slip, one stumble, and the pit would claim them. What must it have been to live a life measured in buckets of filth? To spend nights pulling up what others flushed away, and then walk through the streets with that knowledge hanging heavy as the stench? People avoided them, yes, but people needed them. Without gong farmers, the pits overflowed. Waste seeped into water. Disease followed quickly. In their shadows, they kept the city alive. And so under a cold moon, a farmer lifted another bucket. His arms strained. The rope creaked. A splash echoed as more muck poured into the cart. The horses stamped and snorted at the smell. A fellow labourer wiped his brow, eyes red from the fumes. Lanterns flickered, casting long shadows against the walls of sleeping houses. No one stirred inside. No one wished to watch. There was an odd kind of rhythm to it all. Shovel, lift, rope, pour. Again and again until the pit was finally clear, the bottom scraped clean, the foul harvest gone. Boards were replaced, stones reset, as if nothing had happened. By morning, the house rose to new light, the family within none the wiser to the night's hidden toil. But the farmer knew. He carried the memory of each pit with him. The sound of dripping, the slap of buckets, the smell that never faded. He carried it into his bed, into his food, into the very air he breathed. There was no escaping it. To be a gong farmer was to live in shadow, to breathe the underside of life itself. Yet strangely, some endured for years. They formed small brotherhoods of labour, men who understood what others could not bear. They drank together after their work, cups of ale cutting through the taste of their night. They laughed at the disgusted looks of townsfolk, knowing those same mouths would beg for their services soon enough. They took pride, in a bitter way, at being invisible guardians of health. And beneath that pride, always fear. For death was never far from their work. To shovel filth was to court sickness, fevers, infections, sores that would not heal. The hands of a gong farmer told his story. Nails split, skin raw, palms hardened like leather. His face, often pale, sometimes carried the yellow tint of poor air. His back bent under years of hauling. Yet he returned, night after night, for coin and survival. Sometimes he passed the churchyard on his way home, the graves fresh with morning dew. He and the gravedigger shared something, though they rarely spoke. Both worked among what others wished to forget. One laid down the dead, the other cleared what the living could not hold. Both were shadows. Both were necessary. The city above thrummed with markets and bells, with laughter and prayers. But below, in holes dug deep and dark, the gong farmer laboured. His footsteps were rarely heard, his name rarely known, his presence marked only by the sudden disappearance of stench from a house. He was a ghost of necessity, walking where no one wanted to follow. When dawn came, his cart was emptied beyond the town walls. Sometimes the waste was piled into mounds, left to steam under the sun. Sometimes it was sold as fertilizer, spread over fields with the same hands that had scooped it from pits. Farmers would tread the same filth back into soil, seed sown in it, crops nourished by it. And so the cycle turned, refuse into food, food into refuse, on and on without end. The gong farmer watched this with weary eyes. He knew what he touched would feed others, that what he hauled would, in strange time, become bread on their tables. But he also knew no one wanted to think of him when they ate. His work had no feast days, no blessings, no songs, only shadows, only silence, only the steady drip of waste into waiting buckets. And as the city stirred to life, he vanished into his small corner, unseen, unthanked, carrying the night's stench into another sleep. Morning light did not always bring freshness. In some quarters of town, the dawn carried with it a stench sharp enough to cut through the chatter of markets and the clatter of carts. It rose from the tannery, where hides were stripped, soaked, scraped and transformed into leather. This was the realm of the tanner, whose days unfolded in sweat and ash, in filth disguised as craft. To pass a tannery was to wrinkle one's nose, to draw a sleeve across the face. The air was thick with rot. The reek of animal flesh left us steep in foul mixtures. Dogs barked nearby, hungry for scraps, but even they hesitated at the smell. Here, work was both necessary and unbearable, and those who did it were marked in ways no washing could erase. The process began long before leather took shape. Fresh hides, stripped from animals at the butcher's block, arrived still heavy with fat, blood and hair. They were piled in heaps, slick and glistening, attracting flies by the thousands. The tanner stood among them with a practised eye, knowing which skins would make boots, which might serve as belts, which were too ruined to bother with at all. His hands, calloused and scarred, did not flinch at the gore. He lifted, sorted, flung them into vats with movements that spoke of endless repetition. The vats themselves were pits in the ground, filled with solutions that turned the stomach. Some held urine, collected from chamber pots brought in by the poor who earned a few coins by selling it. Others brimmed with lime, the chalky mixture that burned skin and eyes. Into these pools the hides were dropped, left to soak until hair loosened and flesh softened. The stench was overwhelming, an acrid, choking blend of decay and chemicals that clung to hair and clothes, to skin and lungs. The tanner waded among them, often barefoot or in crude shoes, his legs splashed with liquid that ate at the skin. He stirred the hides with poles, flipped them, pulled them out heavy and dripping. The work was constant, relentless, and it bit into the body as surely as it corroded the senses. His arms ached, his back bent, his fingers stung with small cuts that festered from contact with the filth. Once the hair loosened, scraping began. Hides were stretched over wooden beams, and with sharp knives, the tanner pushed and pulled until tufts of hair and clinging flesh peeled away. It was slow work, the knife rasping rhythmically, the hide shifting beneath steady pressure. Bits of gristle and fat fell to the floor where dogs snapped them up. The tanner barely noticed. His world was narrowed to the strip of hide before him, the scrape of blade, the sweat stinging his eyes. And still, this was only the beginning. To preserve the leather, to turn it from rotting flesh into something durable, the hides had to be soaked in more foulness still. Barrels of dung and rotting bark stood waiting, their contents stirred into thick, reeking sludge. The hides went in again, steeped in mixtures that softened fibres, toughened surfaces, prepared them for shaping. The tanner's arms plunged into the vats, hauling, turning, lifting. His clothes, already soaked with one stench, absorbed another. There was no escaping it. The neighbours hated the tanner's yard. Houses nearby were tainted by the smell, gardens wilted, food seemed to spoil faster. Children mocked the workers as they passed, pinching noses and laughing. Women muttered that no decent man could come from such labour. Even priests hesitated, some refusing to grant tanners burial in consecrated ground, as though the taint of their trade seeped into the soul itself. Yet leather was vital. Without it, there were no boots for soldiers, no belts for labourers, no harnesses for horses, no bindings for books. Every household used it, relied on it. And so, like the gravedigger and the gong farmer, the tanner bore the scorn of the community while serving it all the same. He was despised but indispensable, cursed but unavoidable. Day after day, the rhythm continued, hides in, hides out, scraping, stirring, soaking, drying. His body bore the marks, cracked skin, burns from lime, joints swollen from lifting. His eyes watered constantly. His sense of smell dulled to nearly nothing, but habit carried him forward. One hide finished meant another waiting. One barrel emptied meant another to be filled. The soundscape of the yard was as relentless as the work itself. Knives rasped across hides, poles splashed in vats, carts creaked under new deliveries of skins. Crows circled overhead, drawn by the promise of scraps. The men spoke little, their voices muffled by cloths tied around faces. When they laughed, it was short, bitter, quickly drowned out by the scrape and splash of labour. At night, the tanner went home carrying the smell like a cloak. No amount of scrubbing with ash or herbs erased it. His wife smelled it in the bedclothes. His children carried it on their own garments from his touch. Doors closed when he walked by. In taverns, men shifted away. His coin was welcome, but his presence lingered too strongly to ignore. Some tanners leaned into it, hardening themselves against the disdain. They joked loudly, clapped each other on the back, pretended not to notice the recoil of neighbours. Others grew quiet, shrinking into themselves, avoiding gatherings where their trade would be whispered about. Some sought solace in drink, the sharpness of ale cutting briefly through the dull weight of their existence. And yet there was pride too, hidden deep beneath the layers of grime. To take what would rot and render it strong was a kind of alchemy. The boots that marched, the saddles that carried knights, the gloves that gripped reins, all bore the tanner's touch. No one praised him, but his work endured. Leather lasted when cloth tore, when wood splintered, when iron rusted. His labour outlived him. The yard itself bore witness to this strange endurance. Walls stained black from years of splashes, floors slick with residues ground into the stone, piles of discarded scraps buzzing with flies. And amid it all, men bent to their work as though nothing else existed. The city might rise in festivals, in feasts and sermons, but the tannery knew only its endless cycle of foulness and transformation. On the edge of the yard, a boy watched, his nose wrinkled, his eyes wide. Perhaps he was the son of a tanner, perhaps a poor child sent to apprentice. He saw the vats, the knives, the hides stretched and dripping. He saw the men, their hands red and raw, their clothes stiff with filth. He did not yet understand the years of sweat and ash ahead, the lifetime of being marked as untouchable, but he would learn, as all apprentices learned, that survival left little room for pride. And so the tanner's life unfolded, not in grand events, not in moments of triumph, but in the steady grind of labour no one wanted to see. His work was both curse and necessity, both shame and strength. The world turned on the backs of men like him, though the world pretended otherwise. As the sun sank and the yard fell into shadows, the hides hung dripping from racks, swaying gently in the evening breeze. The stench lingered, heavy and inescapable, but in the quiet there was also something else. The faint creak of leather drying, becoming what it was meant to be. The day's labour, foul and exhausting, had shaped something enduring. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin again. The city never truly slept. Even as night folded itself away, a different kind of waking began. Not with roosters or bells, but with the groan of iron grates and the faint hiss of kindling catching fire. Kitchens needed their warmth, parlours demanded their glow, and hearths across the town stirred back to life. Where there was fire, there was smoke, and where there was smoke, there was always someone tasked with clearing its path. The chimneys rose high above the streets, blackened towers stitched onto rooftops. Some were wide enough for a man to crawl through with room to spare. Others narrowed until even a child's shoulders scraped the sides. Soot collected there, layer upon layer, a dangerous, choking residue that clung to brick and stone like a second skin. Left too long, it could catch fire, sending sparks racing upward into the rafters, reducing whole houses to ash. And so the sweeps came, long before dawn, their shadows slipping between alleys, bundles of rods and brushes clattering softly at their sides. They were not men alone. Many were boys, thin, undersized, forced into narrow spaces no adult could fit. Apprentices they were called, though few had chosen the trade. Their masters bought them from desperate families or plucked them from orphanages, promising food and shelter in exchange for labour that consumed both body and spirit. At the mouth of a chimney, a boy would be shoved upward, his limbs scrawny, his ribs sharp against soot-stained skin. He climbed with knees and elbows, wriggling like a worm through the blackened shaft. The walls scraped him raw, brick and mortar tearing at his skin. Soot fell into his eyes, his mouth, his lungs. Every breath tasted of ash. Every cough left streaks of black across his teeth. Above, the morning sky waited, faint light seeping through smoke-stained openings. But for the child inside, there was only darkness. Only the endless scraping of brushes against walls. The sound echoed in the shaft, hollow and rhythmic, a strange percussion of survival. From below the master barked instructions, the voice sharp, impatient, higher, scrape harder, clear it. The boy obeyed because there was no other choice. The dangers were everywhere. Chimneys narrowed unexpectedly, trapping small bodies in crushing silence. Some shafts twisted, leaving a boy disoriented, his voice muffled as he cried for help. There were stories whispered among the sweeps of children suffocating, wedged where no hand could reach, their cries fading to nothing. Masters, desperate to retrieve brushes or unclog chimneys, sometimes lit fires beneath, forcing boys upward with smoke and heat until their lungs burned raw. Those who survived coughed for days, their small chests rattling. Those who did not were forgotten, their ashes mingled with the soot they had been sent to clear. And still, dawn after dawn, the work continued. The city demanded clean chimneys, and the sweeps delivered them. No one wanted to see how. Customers nodded politely, coins changing hands, but doors closed quickly behind, leaving the sweep and his apprentice in the street, with soot clinging to hair and lashes. Passers-by stepped aside, wary of the black dust that trailed in their wake. Children pointed, adults turned away. The boys grew into the shape of their labour. Their bodies bent, their growth stunted. Knees thickened from endless climbing, shoulders narrowed by confinement. They coughed through their youth, spitting flecks of black into rags. Doctors gave it names later, soot warts, chimney sweep's cancer. But in the moment, it was simply another ache, another reminder of the dark tunnels they had crawled. And yet there was a strange resilience among them. In the earliest hours, when masters' eyes were elsewhere, boys whispered to each other in alleys, trading stories, daring one another with boasts of the narrowest chimney conquered, the highest climb survived. Their laughter was brief, a spark in the gloom, quickly swallowed by coughs. But in those moments, they were children still, clinging to scraps of childhood amid the soot. The masters, hardened men themselves, carried long rods with bundles of bristles. When the shafts were wide enough, they used these tools, thrusting them upward, knocking loose the soot that rained down in choking clouds. Their faces were streaked black, their clothes stiff with years of grime. They moved from house to house with practiced indifference, negotiating wages, counting coins, all while the boys prepared to climb again. In grand houses, with chimneys that stretched high above tiled roofs, the sweeps perched precariously, their silhouettes framed against the pale sky. A fall could mean shattered bones, but the work demanded it. They balanced on ledges, prodding and scraping, soot billowing out into the morning air. From below, neighbours watched silently, thankful their own hearths burned safely. Few spoke to the sweeps, fewer still asked after their apprentices. The smell of smoke clung to them always, sharper even than the stench of the tannery or the cesspits. It filled their lungs, seeped into their hair, embedded itself in every crease of their skin. No washing rid them of it. They were men of smoke, marked by it, carried by it, swallowed by it. As the sun rose, fires crackled to life across the city, smoke curling from rooftops into the morning air. Each column of grey told a story. A chimney cleared, a boy scraped raw, a man pocketing coins. The city warmed itself by labour it refused to acknowledge, soot swept aside in silence. By midday, the sweeps retreated, weary, coughing, eyes red. They gathered in corners, their bodies blackened, their voices hoarse. Masters drank from mugs of ale, apprentices curled against walls, too tired to eat. The tools leaned nearby, brushes stiff with soot, ropes tangled, rods clattering softly in the breeze. And then, when the fires burned low again, the cycle would repeat. Dawn would summon them, and they would crawl once more into the dark, swallowed by smoke. The life of a sweep was rarely long. Many apprentices never reached manhood, their lungs giving out, their bodies too scarred by the work. Those who did survive bore the trade upon them forever. Bent backs, stunted limbs, voices rasping like wind through ash. They lingered on the edges of society, recognised by their blackened clothes, avoided by those who warmed themselves by their labour. And yet, the chimneys stood. Fires burned safely. Families gathered by halves without thought for what had been endured to keep the flames contained. Leather, graves, dung, smoke, the city's hidden labours bound together, unseen, unspoken, but vital all the same. As the day dimmed and the rooftops grew shadowed, the chimneys exhaled their last smoke into the twilight sky. And beneath them, in narrow alleys, a boy's cough echoed, soft, persistent, swallowed by the night. The soot never washed away completely. Even when the sweeps stumbled back into the daylight, when hands were scrubbed raw in cold water and faces streaked with damp rags, the smell lingered, and the coughing never ceased. But the city was not kind enough to let anyone rest in one misery for long. Smoke faded into another burden, and from blackened chimneys we slipped down into the folds of cloth, where a quieter, crawling affliction thrived. It began in beds, in seams of shirts, in the rough fibres of wool cloaks. Lice were everywhere. They thrived in warmth, in crowds, in the places where people huddled close against the cold. Nobleman and beggar alike scratched beneath their collars, feeling the constant prickle of tiny jaws feeding on their skin. To be alive in those times was, almost without exception, to be inhabited by something else. But for some, lice were not only an irritation, they were a livelihood. Among the strangest professions to grow out of necessity was that of the louse collector, the unwanted custodian of these parasites. In courts, monasteries, and households that could afford it, people hired others to sit with them, plucking lice one by one from hair and clothing, squashing them between fingernails, or saving them in bowls, sometimes even jars, as proof of diligence. The work was slow, intimate, unrelenting. A louse collector leaned close to another's scalp, parting greasy strands of hair, searching for the minute glint of movement. Fingertips hovered, pinched, pulled. Sometimes they cracked the insects immediately, leaving tiny smears on the nail. Other times they dropped them into a container, where the bugs wriggled, alive, a grotesque harvest of the morning's effort. Hours passed in this way, hunched in slants, the only sounds the soft scratching of nails through hair and the faint pop of insects being crushed. There was no romance in this labour. The collector's face often hovered inches from unwashed skin, their nose filled with the sour musk of sweat, old fabric, and the faint metallic tang of dried blood where bites had scabbed. The body became a landscape, every fold of cloth, every seam, every tuft of hair a hiding place for the creatures. And the collector travelled this terrain endlessly, eyes trained for the slightest twitch, nails ready to snap shut. For the wealthy, it was a kind of maintenance, no more shameful than having one's garments laundered or boots shined. But for the collector, it was something else entirely. Hours bent over another's flesh, fingers sore, eyes straining, mind numbed by repetition. No skill, no craft, only the endless harvest of parasites. Children were often pressed into the role, their small fingers quick and nimble, their eyesight sharp. In monasteries, novices combed through the robes of senior brothers, dutifully removing the pests that no amount of prayer could ward away. In noble courts, servants bent over embroidered gowns, fingers brushing away lice, even as courtiers whispered of politics and intrigue. The collector was invisible, their labour acknowledged only when it was absent, when an infestation grew too noticeable, when scratching became too public. Then they were scolded, ordered to redouble their efforts, as if the tide of vermin could ever truly be held back. There was no protection for the collector themselves. Each louse they plucked had likely fed already, and handling them meant inevitable transfer. The insects crept into the collector's own sleeves, their own hair. Work followed them home, multiplying as they slept. The collector became a host as much as harvester, cursed to carry the very creatures they were paid to destroy. And worse still, lice were not harmless. They carried with them the spectre of disease, typhus, relapsing fevers, that swept through armies and towns with merciless efficiency. To be close to lice was to be close to sickness, and the collector worked daily at that dangerous threshold. Some did not survive long. Others bore the scars of fevers that racked their bodies again and again. Yet the profession endured because lice endured. Wars created demand, soldiers packed into barracks, scratching beneath their armour, infestations spreading like fire in straw. Collectors worked the camps, moving from man to man, sometimes armed with nothing more than a comb and a small flame to burn what they gathered. Whole mornings disappeared in the search, while drums beat and orders were shouted around them. A soldier could not fight if he clawed constantly at his own skin. In homes, the work was quieter, but no less degrading. Imagine the silence of a candlelit chamber, where a noble reclined against cushions while a servant picked steadily through their hair, the rhythm of nails against scalp stretching into hours. The collector's world was reduced to the crown of another's head, their own thoughts drifting while their fingers moved on instinct. Time blurred in such work. Only the growing pile of dead lice at their side marked its passage. It was not skilled labour, nor respected, nor decently paid. It was tolerated, necessary, but never honoured. People were glad enough when collectors rid them of discomfort, but no one invited them to sit proudly at tables, no one toasted their efforts. Like the gong farmer in the dark pits, like the sweep climbing into chimneys, the louse collector performed a service others refused to imagine too closely. The work was meant to be invisible, its results enjoyed without thought of the process. And what of the collectors themselves? They carried the marks of their labour in more ways than infestation. Their posture stooped from long hours leaning forward, their eyesight dulled from staring at minute movements in dim light. Fingertips cracked from constant pinching, nails stained. They learned to live with the perpetual itch, the knowledge that whatever they removed from others multiplied in their own homes. It was a harvest they could never truly finish, for the insects bred faster than any hand could pluck them. Some turned bitter, muttering under their breath as they worked. Others found a strange rhythm in it, almost meditative, losing themselves in the monotony. A few even joked, claiming they knew their masters more intimately than anyone else, having combed every inch of them, scalp to seam. But laughter rarely lasted long in such work. The scratching never stopped. The city, for all its grandeur, depended on such labour. Fires burned because chimneys were cleared. Leather was worn because hides were scraped. Streets did not overflow because waste was hauled. And people, restless in their beds, managed to sleep only because unseen fingers combed and crushed the vermin that fed on them. The louse collector was part of that hidden machinery, holding back discomfort just enough for life to continue. As night drew in, the streets quieted, but inside the houses the scratching went on. Collectors bent under candlelight, shadows stretched long on the walls, their fingers tirelessly searching, plucking, squashing, collecting. The air smelled faintly of tallow, of sweat, of something acrid that was neither wholly human nor wholly insect, but a mix of the two. The harvest never ended, and sleep, when it came, was never free of crawling. And so the world turned, carried forward on the backs of those whose labour was never celebrated, whose names were never remembered. They moved in silence, in soot, in stench, in lice. Invisible hands, unseen burdens, lives spent in toil that for others preferred. Don't forget, and we shall sit the fingers that plucked lice from scalps and seams worked in silence, always close to the warmth of another body. Yet not all labour clung to skin and cloth. Some descended deeper, far from air and daylight, into caverns carved by human persistence. Where sweat met stone, another trade flourished, one that coated everything it touched in sharp crystals. Salt, white, gleaming, indispensable. It was called white gold for the power it held, and for the misery it demanded. Salt was survival. Without it, food spoiled, flesh rotted, journeys stalled. Empires arose on its trade, armies marched with it packed in sacks, households measured wealth by their stores of it. Yet before it glittered on tables, before it preserved meat through long winters, it had to be torn from the earth. That task fell to men whose lives were spent in narrow shafts, where walls wept brine and air burned the lungs. The salt mines stretched like hidden labyrinths below ground. Some lay close enough to the surface that the sun's light briefly touched the entrance. Others plunged into darkness so absolute that torches barely revealed the path ahead. The walls glimmered faintly, coated with crystalline crusts that sparkled as if mocking the men who scraped at them. With Picks, with crude chisels, with bare hands sometimes, they pried the mineral free, every strike sending shards into the air. The work gnawed at the body in cruel ways. Salt is no gentle substance. It seeps into cuts and cracks, burning without mercy. The miner's skin, perpetually scraped by stone and tools, became a map of sores, each one kept raw by the sting of crystals. Sweat only worsened the pain, carrying salt into wounds until flesh swelled and reddened. Hands blistered, split, hardened, yet never healed fully. Breathing offered no relief. Dust hung in the tunnels, a fine mist of salt that coated throats and lungs. Every inhale scorched, every cough tasted of bitterness. Some miners spat blood, their chests rattling long after they left the shafts. The body dried from within, thirst rising even as water was scarce. And when they drank, it too tasted faintly of the earth that tormented them. Clothing offered little defence. Fabric grew stiff with salt, rubbing against skin until it abraded. Boots cracked, seams wore thin. Nothing lasted long in that corrosive world. Even metal tools corroded, eaten slowly by the very substance they were meant to extract. Nothing endured. Not leather, not iron, not flesh. The hours stretched endlessly. In some places, men worked by the faint glow of oil lamps. In others, darkness pressed so close it seemed to swallow the flame. The silence was broken only by the ring of metal against stone, the grunt of effort, the groan of timbers holding up ceilings that might collapse at any moment. The deeper the tunnels went, the more uncertain the ground became, and every shift carried the weight of potential disaster. Yet despite the danger, the demand never ceased. Salt caravans crossed continents. Barges carried it down rivers. Coins were minted from its trade. Rulers taxed it ruthlessly. Wars flared over its control. The miner saw little of that wealth. His pay barely fed his family. His body wore out before middle age, and his death was rarely noted beyond the tally of labour lost. White gold enriched cities, but it consumed the men who unearthed it. In some regions, entire towns existed only because of salt. Streets above ground bustled with merchants and guards, but below, men bent double in tunnels, their bodies already crumbling under the weight of the work. Children followed them, small enough to squeeze into narrow seams, prying crystals where grown men could not reach. Their lungs filled just as quickly, their skin scarred just as deeply. Generations were born and buried in the shadow of the mines, lives measured by how long they could endure before the body gave out. Salt touched everything, even in death. Corpses of animals lost in the tunnels sometimes lay preserved for decades, their flesh hardened into something almost eternal. Miners, too, occasionally became part of that grim preservation. A collapse might bury them in salt, and years later their remains emerged, skin and hair eerily intact, a haunting reminder of the substance's power to both sustain and consume. The irony was cruel. Salt healed as well as harmed. Applied to meat, it kept rot at bay. Used sparingly, it flavoured food, kept bodies alive through scarcity. Yet to those who mined it, salt was a poison that seeped into every crack of their existence. They carried it on their skin, in their lungs, in their very bones. Even away from the shafts, they could not escape it. Wives complained of the sting when they embraced. Children noticed the roughness of their hands. Miners themselves spoke of always tasting it, no matter what they ate or drank. The world above rarely thought of this when sprinkling a pinch over bread, when hanging meat to dry for winter. Salt was invisible labour, silent suffering condensed into crystals. People praised its purity, its whiteness, without ever acknowledging the darkness it came from. And still the miners descended, day after day. They learned to walk with stooped backs, to breathe shallowly, to ignore the constant itch of raw skin. They carried torches into the bowels of the earth, knowing each descent could be their last, but compelled by hunger, by taxes, by debts that bound them more tightly than any chain. The mine was a prison disguised as work, and leaving it was rarely an option. Stories whispered among them told of vast chambers deep below, caverns so wide that 1,000 torches could not light them, where the air hung heavy and still. Some swore they heard voices echoing there, as if the salt itself murmured. Others claimed to have seen strange shapes crystallized in the walls, as if the mine remembered every living thing that had passed within. Superstition grew in those tunnels, fed by exhaustion and fear, but whether or not the salt spoke, it always demanded. The miner's world was stripped of softness. No green, no sky, no fresh breeze. Only stone, brine, firelight, and endless labour. And when they emerged at last, squinting into daylight, their bodies that carried the underground with them, skin cracked, lips parched, eyes rimmed red. They lived half above, half below, never fully escaping the mine's grasp. White gold, they called it. Precious, essential, fought over by kings and merchants, but for those who scraped it from the earth, it was neither wealth nor wonder. It was a slow burning of flesh and spirit, a toll extracted daily, a reminder that the world's luxuries are often built on hidden suffering. And so, as markets bustled and meals were salted, deep below, the miners pressed on. Picks rang against stone, crystals shattered loose, sweat stung wounds. The harvest continued, endless as hunger itself, one of history's quietest torments, so ordinary, so necessary, that it became invisible. The earth's gifts could wound as much as they sustained. Salt left its mark in cracked skin and hollowed lungs, but there were burdens heavier than stone, roles carved not by nature, but by human decree. Where the mines devoured bodies quietly in the dark, another duty unfolded in the public square, beneath open skies, before the eyes of a restless crowd. It was a profession no one envied, yet one societies demanded with unwavering certainty. The executioner stood at the boundary between law and death, his shadow long across cobbles stained by centuries of fear. He was not welcomed, though his work was necessary. He was not celebrated, though his hand carried the will of kings, priests, and magistrates. His presence lingered like smoke, acknowledged, tolerated, but never embraced. In the hours before dawn, when towns still slumbered, he prepared. The tools of his trade lay silent but heavy, the axe sharpened to a merciless edge, the rope coiled and ready, the sword gleaming faintly in candlelight. Sometimes it was a wheel, sometimes fire, sometimes iron clamps set aside for the spectacle of pain. Each method required a different hand, a different measure of precision, but all ended the same way. Silence where once there had been a beating heart. Yet the burden was more than physical. To lift the axe, to guide the blade, to knot the rope, it was not done without cost. The executioner lived apart, marked as unclean by the very act that sustained order. Neighbours crossed streets to avoid him, inns denied him entry, children whispered his name as though it might summon ill fortune. He was both servant and outcast, a man who upheld the laws of his land while being condemned by them in spirit. The crowd, too, was never gentle. They gathered eagerly on days of death, pressing into squares, climbing walls and rooftops for a better view. Faces flushed with anticipation, eyes gleaming with something between dread and excitement. Justice was a spectacle, punishment a theatre where morality played out in blood, and at the centre of it all stood the executioner, both actor and instrument, his every movement scrutinised. A misstep could ruin him. If the axe struck poorly, if the rope broke, if the sword faltered, the crowd turned vicious. Stones flew, curses rained down, sometimes even fists sought him out. Mercy was not his to grant, but mistakes brought him no forgiveness. Precision was demanded, though nerves trembled and flesh resisted. To end a life cleanly was a rare skill, honed through grim repetition, yet even the most practised hand could falter. Some rulers sought to dignify the role, granting executioners homes, pay, even estates. Yet wealth never erased stigma. A man might live in comfort, but at every feast his chair was set apart. At every festival his absence was quietly ensured. His children bore his mark as well, finding doors closed to them, marriages refused. Blood stained not only his hands but his lineage. And still, men accepted the role. Sometimes it was inherited, passed from father to son, as though death itself were a family trade. Other times it was forced upon the desperate, the criminal pardoned on condition he serve, the outcast given work when none else would employ him. Once bound, escape was near impossible. The town remembered, the name lingered, no other path lay open. The work itself stretched beyond the scaffold. Executioners often acted as torturers, carrying out interrogations in stone chambers where screams echoed long after the task ended. They swung whips, turned wheels, tightened screws. Their hands grew accustomed to the sounds of cracking joints, to pleas that fell unanswered. To refuse was to betray their office, and to betray their office was to face the same instruments they wielded. But beneath the blood and ritual, there was a quiet humanity often overlooked. Some executioners prayed before their tasks, whispering for forgiveness, not only for the condemned, but for themselves. Others drank heavily, numbing the conscience with ale and wine. A few developed strange tendernesses, steadying a prisoner's arm, offering a whispered word of comfort, ensuring the blade fell swiftly. These moments never absolved them, but they spoke of men trying to live within roles that devoured the soul. Legends swirled around them, stories told of executioners who carried charms to ward off spirits of the slain, who washed their tools with holy water, who buried secret tokens beneath the gallows to keep madness at bay. Some were said to be immune to curses, chosen by fate to wield death without consequence. Others were feared as half-demons, their craft a mark of something unearthly. In truth, they were men trapped in a role larger than themselves, shaped by the demands of order, despised by the very people they served. The scaffold itself was a stage. Under the gaze of hundreds, sometimes thousands, the condemned was led forth, their final words swallowed by noise. The executioner lifted his hand, and silence rippled through the crowd. Time seemed to stretch thin, as though the world itself paused to watch the fall of a blade, the snap of a rope. And when it came, the moment was swift but unforgettable. A body crumpling, a head raised, a silence breaking into cheers or groans. The executioner stood amidst it all, breathing steady, heart heavy, face unreadable. Afterward, he did not linger. Tools were cleaned, garments changed, and he retreated to the margins once more. The square was washed, the crowd dispersed, and life resumed. But in homes across the city, people spoke of the act, recounted it with relish or horror, while the man who had enacted it sat alone, shunned even as his labour was retold. Some grew hardened, embracing their reputation. They wore dark cloaks, carried themselves with grim pride, let the fear they inspired serve as armour. Others withered, retreating into silence, their health failing under the weight of isolation. A few ended their own lives, unable to reconcile duty with conscience. History rarely remembered their names, but their shadows lingered across centuries of law and punishment. It is tempting to see the executioner as a monster, a willing hand of cruelty. Yet to do so is to ignore the structure that placed him there, the laws, the rulers, the crowds who demanded the spectacle. He was no more free than the miner with his pick, no more spared than the sweeper in his chimney. His was simply another burden of history's machinery, necessary to some, loathed by most, carried until the body or soul could bear it no longer. And in the silence after the crowd dispersed, when the blood had dried and the moon rose over empty squares, the executioner remained, alone beneath the weight of his role, beneath the endless gaze of a world that needed him but never wanted him. The scaffold eventually emptied, the crowd dissolved into alleys and taverns, but the weight of necessity never loosened its grip. Punishment had been carried out, order preserved for another day. Yet far from the square, away from stone walls and echoing footsteps, another form of labour waited. Not in the clang of steel, but in the soft sucking of creatures hidden beneath water. The marsh stretched wide, its surface broken by reeds and grasses, its stillness deceptive. Mist rose with the dawn, drifting low across pools where stagnant water mirrored the pale sky. Here, among the rot of fallen plants and the slow drift of decay, bodies waded in. Their feet sank into mud that clutched like hands, their legs brushed against unseen shapes that wriggled and darted. The air reeked of dampness, a mingling of mildew, moss, and something sourer, an odour of slow death clinging to every patch of stagnant earth. It was into this world that leech gatherers stepped, often barefoot, sometimes clothed in rags so thin the water seeped through instantly. Their task was simple in instruction, brutal in practice: to collect leeches, those small, relentless parasites that clung to flesh and fed on blood. Medicine demanded them, physicians prized them, and households stocked jars of them for every ailment. The trade in leeches was brisk, but the gathering of them was misery itself. There was no tool more effective than the body. To lure leeches, one had to offer what they hungered for: warm skin, living blood. So the gatherers waded deep, sometimes to their waists, sometimes further, and stood still. Slowly, inevitably, the water stirred with movement. Slender, slimy bodies slid through reeds, brushing against ankles and calves before attaching with a subtle bite. One, then another, then dozens, fastening themselves with tiny, rasping mouths. The gatherer did not flinch. To startle, to move too quickly, was to lose the catch. So they endured the crawling, the prickling, the slow siphoning of their own strength. The longer they stood, the more heavily they became clothed in living black strands, their skin mottled with the movements of feeding mouths. Blood trickled down shins, spread into the water in faint crimson clouds. When enough had attached, the gatherers pried them off carefully, dropping the writhing harvest into containers, pots, sacks, sometimes even their own mouths used as makeshift holders before spitting them out into jars. It was gruesome work, but it was steady. Physicians across Europe prescribed bloodletting for nearly every ailment: fever, swelling, melancholy, even headaches. A jar of leeches was as valuable in a household as salt or bread. Soldiers carried them on campaigns, nobles demanded them for their private chambers, monasteries stocked them for the sick. And each one began its journey in the marsh, pulled from human skin. But the human body does not yield blood endlessly. Gatherers often staggered home, pale, weak, dizzy from the day's draining. Wounds bled long after the leech was gone, their saliva laced with anticoagulants that kept blood flowing. Clothes stuck to skin, stained dark, sometimes never washed clean again. Infection crept easily into the bites, small sores swelling into ulcers, fevers burning for weeks. Death by leech was rare, but death by the infections they left behind was not. Children joined in the work early. Their smaller bodies were more easily surrounded by leeches, their skin tender and irresistible to the creatures. They waded beside their parents, silent except for occasional whimpers, learning to stand still, to let the parasites feed until jars filled. Many bore scars all their lives, tiny circular marks dotted across shins and thighs, reminders of long mornings spent in water that never warmed. The marsh itself offered little comfort. It was a world of buzzing insects, of mud that sucked at legs until every step was a struggle. Frogs croaked unseen. Birds skimmed the surface. And beneath it all, the constant stir of unseen creatures brushed against the skin. At times the ground gave way suddenly, plunging the gatherer into deeper water, lungs filling with panic before they fought back to their feet. There was no dignity, no safeguard, only the slow toll of blood and patience. And yet, people relied on this trade. In cities far from marshland, leeches were bought in apothecary shops, their jars stacked neatly as if the creatures had been conjured from nowhere. Patients never thought of the pale, trembling figure who had bled in silence so those jars could be filled. Physicians placed leeches delicately on arms and temples, watching them swell with satisfaction, while far away the gatherer nursed the same wounds with no doctor to tend them. Superstition mingled with the practice. Some believed leeches carried the essence of the marsh, that their dark bodies drew out not only blood, but illness itself, dragging sickness into the muck. Gatherers sometimes whispered to themselves as they stood in water, murmuring little prayers that the creatures would feed quickly, that they would not take more than was safe. Others swore they saw shapes moving in the mist, spirits of those drained one time too many, forever bound to the swamp. Still, the work went on. Jars had to be filled, markets supplied. The gatherers rose each morning, stepped back into the chill water, and waited as their blood became currency. And when night came, when the jars clinked heavy at their sides, they trudged home with bodies weakened, faces grey, wounds seeping slowly into rags. Their homes bore the marks of the trade too. Floors stained where jars leaked, the air thick with the smell of stagnant water, pots rattling softly as leeches writhed inside. Children slept to the sound of their movements, the slow sliver of creatures meant to cure but born in filth. A strange coexistence bound gatherer and parasite, each depending on the other, neither free from the bond. No one celebrated them. The marsh had no crowd, no scaffold, no spectacle, only quiet suffering, hidden beneath reeds and fog. And yet, like the miner with his pick, like the executioner with his blade, the gatherer carried a burden without which others could not continue. Their pain, their sickness, their scars became invisible once the leech crossed the threshold of a physician's chamber, transformed from parasite into remedy. So the world balanced itself again. Blood spilled in silence to heal strangers, lives shortened to extend others. And in the stillness of the marsh, under grey skies and drifting mist, the gatherer waited, motionless, patient, enduring, as tiny mouths opened and closed, and the river carried its slow song around them. When the mist of the marsh thins, and the sound of reeds fades, the world does not grow kinder. The damp silence gives way to the restless hum of a city, its alleys twisting like veins, its air filled with the mingled weight of coal smoke, dung, and the sharp tang of refuse. London, sprawling and ceaseless, was not a place where waste disappeared. It lingered, piled high, rotting and burning, until someone desperate enough carried it away. Amid the roar of carts and the clatter of hooves, there were those who made their living not by crafting or selling, but by sifting through what others discarded. They were called bone grubbers, men, women, even children whose days passed bent low to the earth, eyes scanning the filth for the pale shards of death. Bones were never truly worthless. Burned, they turned to ash prized by soap makers and fertilizer merchants. Crushed, they became part of porcelain or were spread upon fields to strengthen soil. In an age before modern chemistry and synthetic goods, every fragment of animal life was pressed into service long after flesh had rotted away. The bone grubber, filthy and hunched, was the link in that chain, the one who plucked remains from the muck, sorted them from the endless tide of rubbish, and hauled them to buyers who rarely asked from where they had come. The work began at dawn, when the streets were still damp from night air, and the previous day's leavings festered in the gutters. Markets yielded heaps of scraps, fish heads, vegetable peelings, gnawed bones dropped careless beneath benches. Outside taverns, piles of refuse grew rank, tankards spilling stale ale over gnawed rib bones and chicken carcasses. The grubber picked through it all with bare hands or a crooked stick, pulling what was solid from what was slime. Pockets and sacks filled quickly, the clink of bone distinct beneath the soft squelch of rotting matter. But it was not only markets and taverns that gave them their finds. The city had darker offerings. The knackers' yards, where horses too broken for labour were slaughtered, left heaps of carcass and skull. Dogs dragged away scraps, children poked at the ruins with sticks, but the grubber came for the bones, hauling away what stank too strongly for others to touch. Even churchyards whispered to them. In places where ground was turned over hastily, where new graves pressed upon old, fragments surfaced, a jawbone here, a rib there, pale against dark earth. Some grubbers, when need outweighed fear, pried deeper, disturbing what should have rested. To the respectable citizens who hurried past, they were invisible, shadows hunched in rags, carrying sacks that rattled with death. They stank, their hands blackened with soot and rot, their faces gaunt. To look at them too closely was to see the city's entrails laid bare. Better to avert the eyes, to hurry onward, while they stooped in gutters, pulling marrowless relics from slime. Yet their labour threaded itself into every household. The white ash used to scrub a floor, the polish on a lady's porcelain teacup, the fertiliser spread over a gentleman's garden, all bore the imprint of the grubber's toil. Every clean surface carried with it the shadow of dirt, of hands rummaging through refuse, of bones scraped from death's heap. Life for the bone grubber was not measured in wealth, but in survival. A day's labour might fill a sack heavy enough to fetch a few pennies at the rag and bone shop. A strong back, a sharp eye, and a stomach hardened against stench could keep hunger at bay, though never far. Illness clung to them, sores from cuts gone septic, coughs from breathing dust and ash, fevers that never broke fully. Children often followed their parents into the work, their small hands darting quicker through heaps, their bare feet navigating alleys where sharper refuse lay hidden. There was no protection from what they touched. In animal bones lingered the rot of disease. In human fragments, whispers of plague or pox. Rats scurried through the same piles, carrying fleas and sickness. Cuts festered, lungs filled with soot. And yet, the grubber went on, because the city was endless, and so was its waste. What made the work most cruel was its invisibility. Where miners bore their blackened skin as the mark of their trade, where executioners carried the weight of silence and fear, the bone grubber was not acknowledged at all. No one thanked them for clearing alleys, for feeding the fires of industry with their collections. They were beneath notice, the lowest of the low, tolerated only because they rid the city of its filth. At times, desperation drove them into dangers beyond rot. Fires often swept through the cramped neighbourhoods, leaving behind ruins smouldering with char and ash. For the bone grubber, this was opportunity. They crept into half-collapsed structures, prying charred beams aside, seeking bones of animals or, grimly, of humans left behind. Ash still warm clung to skin, smoke seared throats and walls threatened to fall. But ash, gathered in sacks, was worth coin, and so they risked collapse and suffocation for a few handfuls more. Others scoured the Thames' muddy banks, where refuse from the entire city washed ashore. At low tide, they picked through slime and seaweed, pulling out bones polished smooth by water, sometimes prying at carcasses trapped in the mud. The stench was unbearable, the footing treacherous, but the river did not stop delivering its offerings. Day after day, the tide turned up new fragments, and day after day, the grubbers were there to meet it. Their presence unsettled those who thought of themselves as above such labour. Stories spread that bone grubbers trafficked in graveyards, that they carried curses from the dead, that their sacks held not only animals, but the remnants of neighbours lost to disease. Children were warned to stay away from them, yet those same children might be sent to the apothecary to buy soap made from the very ash those grubbers had delivered. The hypocrisy was constant, but unnoticed. By night, the grubbers returned to their quarters, often no more than damp cellars or collapsing tenements where families crowded together, their air as rank as the streets they worked. They laid out their day's collection, sorting by size, scraping away the worst of the rot. Pots simmered with water to boil bones down further, steam filling the air with the thick stench of marrow. Then came the waiting, for buyers, for merchants, for the chance to turn another day of degradation into a few coins to keep starvation at bay. And so the cycle went on. Every morning, the city awoke, producing waste. Every day, the grubber stooped low, harvesting it. Every evening, buyers turned that refuse into goods polished and respectable, their origins forgotten. Behind every clean surface lay the unseen hand of those who had lived ankle-deep in filth, their bodies slowly unravelling from exposure to disease and exhaustion. The bone grubber's story is not one of sudden spectacle, nor of dramatic end. It is one of slow erosion, of dignity stripped by necessity, of life bent double beneath the weight of a sack filled with the remnants of death. The city consumed itself endlessly, and the grubber stood in the middle of the cycle, neither honoured nor truly despised, only endured, much like the waste they carried, and in that silence, under the heavy breath of smoke, they disappeared into the alleys once more, their shadows bending over the earth, their hands searching ceaselessly for pale fragments in the dark. Even as the city above stirred into the light, a darker rhythm moved through its veins, invisible yet indispensable, where refuse and ash piled high in alleyways, where bones had been sifted and sorted, a different kind of filth lay waiting, one that no carted rubbish or scavenged bones could mask. The streets themselves breathed with it, and it was the night soil men who answered that call. By the time dawn stretched over London, its chimneys coughing smoke and rooftops slick with morning dew, the night soil men had already begun. Their carts rolled through darkened lanes, pulled by horses or pushed by human hands, collecting the city's human waste. Chamber pots, privies, cesspits, every container, every pit overflowing from the night before, was emptied into their barrels, a stench so concentrated it turned the stomach of anyone who dared linger. The work demanded early hours and stronger constitutions than most possessed. Even seasoned labourers flinched at the smell, gagged at its power, yet these men moved with grim efficiency. They lifted lids, plunged long-handled scoops into excrement, scraped the sludge into barrels, and hoisted weighty loads without pause. Every motion coated them in the invisible sheen of filth. Every breath carried the metallic, sour tang of human effluent. This was labour that left no mark of accomplishment, no visible reward beyond the simple fact that the city continued to function. Privies emptied, streets cleared, households spared the overflowing mess that otherwise would have festered in every corner. And yet, the men themselves were invisible, tolerated only for the service they rendered. To the passerby, they were shadows, figures hunched beneath barrels, moving silently while others breakfasted in comparative comfort. The city's architecture itself seemed designed to punish them. Narrow alleys funneled the odour, cobblestones slicked with rain and waste, and stairways rose steeply from lower quarters to upper streets. Each trip to the dump required endurance, muscles straining under the weight of barrels, lungs tasting the stench, hands blackened by grime. The work was unending. Every household produced its nightly deposit. Every alley accumulated its secret streams. The cycle repeated day after day, and there was no relief, no seasonal reprieve. Even the equipment offered little comfort. Barrels leaked, scoops splintered, lids stuck stubbornly to their hinges. The men often had to break through hardened deposits, scraping and prying with strength and patience, skin blistering, nails cracked. Their clothes, already thick with prior layers of grime, became sodden, smelling of rot and chemicals used to mask the odour. Some soaked in brine or lime, but even that barely softened the assault. In winter, the stench froze into ice, hard and sharp, yet no less potent. Hands stiffened in cold air while trying to manipulate slippery barrels. Water in the streets froze in jagged sheets, hiding mounds of refuse beneath fragile surfaces. Men fell, bruised and scraped, yet the city would not wait. The waste accumulated, regardless of frost or snow, and the night soil men pressed on, indifferent to wind or rain or frostbite. Children and apprentices often accompanied the more experienced workers. Their small hands were useful for tipping pots or scraping corners that adults could not reach, but they learned quickly to brace themselves against the horror of constant odour and the occasional splash. Laughter was rare, muttered complaints even rarer. The work demanded focus, and survival depended on endurance. Many would carry the smell with them for life, its memory inescapable, imprinted on the skin and hair long after the day ended. Disease lurked around every corner. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid. Illness thrived in the very substance these men collected. Flies, drawn to the stench, bred rapidly, laying eggs in heaps of excrement that would later hatch, adding to the horror. Cuts from splintered barrels, scratches from foul masonry, or even the occasional kick from a restless horse became infection points. Hospitals were for the wealthy. For these men, wounds festered in silence. Death was a constant companion, often close at hand, yet rarely acknowledged by the broader world. Night soil men also contended with the disdain of those they served. A polite cough, a wrinkled nose, a turned face. These were as certain as the stench itself. Their labour was necessary, yet socially unmentionable. They were tolerated, feared, or mocked, yet never truly respected. Markets thrived, streets stayed clean, families avoided illness. But the hands that made it possible were coated in grime, lungs scented with rot, and spirits weighed by constant disgust. There were moments when their labour crossed paths with other trades. Bone grubbers, ash collectors, rag pickers, all occupied the same alleys at different hours, shuffling past the same pools of waste. their efforts overlapping in a choreography of survival. Yet even among these fellow sufferers, the Night Soil Men were singularly burdened. Their cargo was live, pungent, impossible to ignore. The very essence of the city's rejection pressed into barrels, carts and skin. By afternoon, when the sun rose higher and the streets filled with voices and horses and commerce, the men retreated to the outskirts. Dumps awaited, often pits or open areas where waste could be buried or burned, lime thrown over to dull odour and accelerate decomposition. Here, labour remained relentless. Barrels were tipped, sludge spread, ashes added. Hands scraped every last trace, muscles quivering from strain. Even in these moments, there was no applause, no audience, only the faint clink of metal against stone, the squelch of substance against shovel, and the ever-present stench that refused to be banished. In some parts of the city, law attempted to regulate them. Ordinances dictated schedules, limits, methods. Yet regulation did not ease the work, it only enforced it. The barrels still had to be emptied, the streets still had to breathe. Compliance was survival, not comfort. And so, day after day, night after night, they moved silently through darkness and dawn, the city's shadow army of sanitation. Even at home, relief was fleeting. Clothing retained the stench, hair absorbed it, and furniture in cramped rooms seemed to reek faintly of the day's labour. Families adapted, breathing quickly and holding meals at arm's length. Children learned to recognise the smell as part of life, adults to endure it. Yet there was no celebration, no appreciation, only the faint hope that tomorrow would be slightly easier, that the barrels might be lighter, the pits slightly closer, the work slightly less unbearable. Night Soil Men carried the city on their backs, yet remained ghosts within it. Streets functioned, alleys cleared, homes spared the mess that could have strangled life itself. And still, they were invisible, known only by the smell that hung faintly wherever they passed, unacknowledged, necessary, enduring. Their labour was one of humanity's quietest horrors, a service no one asked for, but all depended on. Even centuries later, their presence is a faint trace in the history of the city, a memory buried under the cobblestones, under the soot, under the daily rhythm of streets that seemed clean, but were, in truth, maintained by hands coated in rot, lungs filled with the stench of life's waste, and bodies enduring the invisible punishment that survival demanded. The streets smelled faintly of rot and damp, the memory of night soil lingering in gutters and alleys, when the next trade pulled men into darkness, not below the city, but into its belly of fire and ash. Coal heaving was no delicate work. It demanded brute strength, endless stamina, and lungs that could endure the thick, choking dust that clung to every surface. When night soil men bore the scent of human waste, coal heavers bore blackness itself, as if they had swallowed night and carried it on their skin. Coal was the lifeblood of the city, powering furnaces, heating homes, fueling industry. It moved through a chain as unyielding as any of the trades before, miners deep in the earth, barges dragging the cargo down rivers, dock hands loading the tons, and finally the coal heavers themselves, tasked with transporting, distributing, and storing it where it would be burned. Every shovel, every sack, every wheelbarrow was a tool of endurance, and every day wore the men down inch by inch. The work began at dawn, often earlier, in the shadowed wharves or dark storage yards. Coal arrived in heaps so massive it seemed the earth had vomited black stone onto the docks. Men bent to its weight, shoveling into baskets, dragging sacks, lifting barrows upstairs slick with soot and rain. Every movement was repetitive. Each strike against a heap, another echo of the day's monotony. The coal dust coated their hands, stuck to faces, settled into eyes, nose, and mouth. Breathing became labour itself. Every inhale carrying particles that scratched lungs and clung to the throat. The labour was unrelenting. A single misstep, a dropped sack, a slipped foot, a hand crushed against stone, could mean hours of injury or weeks without work. Fingers were split, nails blackened and torn, skin cracked beneath the relentless abrasion. Clothes were stained within moments of leaving home, the smell of smoke and ash penetrating hair and skin until every fibre of existence seemed coated in the residue of the trade. Many of the heavers were children, small enough to squeeze into spaces between piles, light enough to haul baskets that would crush an adult's back. Their faces became permanently smudged with soot, their hair stiff with grime, their hands raw and bleeding from repeated contact with sharp coal edges. Apprentices learned quickly, speed and endurance mattered more than comfort or safety. Mistakes could cost them, and accidents were common. Still, families depended on the wages, and children bent to necessity as surely as the adults did. Workdays were long, stretching into twilight, when the city's fires burned low and smoke from chimneys began to mingle with the smell of the docks. Sweat clung to every pore, turning coal dust into a coarse paste that cut the skin. Muscles ached, backs screamed, and lungs wheezed with the burden of inhaled particles. Yet the work never stopped, for coal was constant. Houses needed fuel, factories demanded fire, merchants required stock to move along canals and streets. The labour of the heavers was invisible except for the black traces left behind, their fingerprints on wood, the streaks along walls, the stains that could not be washed away. In addition to sheer physical exhaustion, there was danger. Piles of coal shifted without warning, crushing limbs. Barrels or baskets tipped, spilling heavy loads onto anyone beneath. Sparks from furnaces ignited dust, small explosions scattering fragments of stone and fire alike. The men learned to move with the heaps, to anticipate shifts, to protect themselves and each other with swift reflexes. But even the most experienced could not avoid every accident. Limbs were broken, backs sprained, faces scarred. Some men carried permanent injuries, a testimony to the relentlessness of the work. The docks and yards were not forgiving either. Rain turned paths to mud, making wheels slide and baskets slip. Cold seeped through rags, and water clung to coal, making it heavier, slicker, more dangerous. In winter, ice formed along riverbanks and stairs, and the dust mixed with moisture to create a black sludge that hardened in boots and gloves. Pain became constant, rhythm became survival, and endurance became the only measure of success. Coal heavers worked alongside dockhands, bargemen, and merchants, but their labour was the most physically taxing. Whereas others lifted lighter cargo, pushed carts along level streets, or supervised trade, the heaver was bent over, constantly on the edge of collapse, moving tons of black stone into furnaces and storage. They existed in a haze of smoke and dust, invisible except when the sacks or baskets failed, leaving a trail of black across the ground. Illness was endemic. Lungs blackened by dust, throats raw from inhaled ash, eyes burned perpetually, skin irritated and infected. Coughs became chronic, wheezing punctuated sleep. Fever struck unpredictably, sometimes leaving men too weak to work for weeks. Doctors were rare, expensive, and often dismissive. Self-medication with alcohol or herbal remedies became a necessity. Many succumbed early, their bodies worn down by the relentless grind of coal, their labour ending not with ceremony, but in silent exhaustion. Children fared even worse. Small frames could lift baskets, but repeated exposure meant stunted growth, weakened bones and lungs filled with particulate. Some developed lifelong conditions, others died in adolescence. Families depended on their contribution, yet the cost was high. A cycle repeated generation after generation, each child stepping into soot-stained shoes, faces blackened before they could fully understand the world beyond the yards. Yet coal heaving was indispensable. Without it, homes went cold, workshops stalled, and the city's machinery slowed to a halt. Fire demanded fuel, and fuel demanded men who could endure the black, the dust, the relentless strain. Payment was sparse, dignity rarer still, and recognition almost non-existent. Only the scars remained as testimony: cracked hands, split nails, bent backs, lungs wheezing under strain, faces permanently shadowed by soot. At night, the heavers trudged home, carrying baskets and barrows empty or filled, bodies shaking from exertion. Black streaks ran along their arms and legs, faces smudged and unwashed, hair stiff with coal dust. Their homes were modest, heat rare, and respite short. Meals were simple, often eaten quickly before exhaustion claimed them. Sleep was deep but brief, for dawn would come again, and the city's fires would demand fuel once more. There were stories among them, whispers of men who had fallen under heaps, crushed by ton after ton of black stone. Some vanished into the river with overturned barges, bodies never recovered. Superstition mingled with reality. Some said the coal itself held spirits of miners, angry and restless, punishing the careless. Others believed that inhaled dust carried the essence of the fire, making men half ash, half flesh. Whether legend or truth, the stories kept caution alive, for mistakes meant pain or death. The work continued in silence, unbroken except by the shuffle of boots, the scrape of baskets, the occasional barked order. Smoke rose from chimneys, mingling with the dust, covering the city in haze. Blackened faces moved among the heaps, fleeting, unremarkable to the untrained eye, yet essential to the life of every household, every workshop, every fire that burned long into the night. And so, coal heavers bore the city on their backs, lifting its warmth from raw stone, carrying exhaustion in every muscle, soot in every pore. They were unseen, uncelebrated, and yet irreplaceable. A shadowed army fueling progress while being consumed by it in turn. Their labour was relentless, unending, brutal, and necessary, another thread in the tapestry of work that demanded more than the body could willingly give. The dust of coal still clung to the lungs and skin, lingering in alleys, seeping into the corners of homes where warmth was scarce and the air always heavy. Even as the fires burned and the city stirred, another threat prowled beneath the shadows, one that would not bend, tire, or be placated by strength alone. Rats, vermin, sly and innumerable, scuttling along walls, through gutters, across rooftops, beneath floors, and inside the very walls of the houses that burned coal for warmth. And it was the rat catcher who bore the responsibility of keeping them at bay. The city's sewers were a labyrinth, a network of stinking tunnels carved beneath cobblestone streets, where waste flowed unceasingly and darkness ruled with absolute authority. Above, life thrummed and commerce swirled. Below, in those twisting passages, the rat caught in shadow, moving in waves, breeding faster than any human could track. The rat catcher entered this world with tools and traps, with dogs trained to sniff out vermin, with a patience honed over years of failure and fleeting victories. His days began in the narrow alleys, carts creaking beneath the weight of cages and snares, nets and rods in hand. He prowled through marketplaces, knocking over barrels, peering beneath stalls, listening for the faintest scratching beneath boards. Every shadow was suspect, every hole a potential nest. The smell of the streets, half coal smoke, half human refuse, half something unnameable, was constant, mingling with the stench of the vermin he pursued. The work was relentless. Rats were fast, cunning, and reproducing constantly. For every one caught, a dozen more waited in shadows, hidden in attics, walls, basements, and sewers. Catching them required skill, not just brute force. A delicate trap, a poisoned bait, a quiet hand. The slightest noise could scatter them into the underworld, and hours of patient observation could end in frustration. Yet the hunter persisted, because the alternative was disease, famine among stored goods, and homes overrun. Children often assisted the rat catcher, their small fingers useful for extracting trapped vermin or laying bait in tight corners. Apprentices learned the signs of nests, the faint scuffs along walls, the droppings that marked passageways. They learned not to flinch when a tail brushed a hand, not to recoil when teeth gnawed at traps, not to gasp when a vermin leapt unexpectedly from shadow. The work demanded endurance of the stomach, steadiness of hand, and an imagination hardened against fear. Above all, there was danger. Rats carried disease, the plague that lingered in memory, typhus that stalked the city. Their bites could infect. Their urine and feces could contaminate food and water. The rat catcher did not retreat. He entered the sewers, the attics, the hidden spaces beneath floors where vermin multiplied. The tunnels were narrow and dark, filled with filth, water, and decay. One misstep, a slick stone, a sudden shift, could mean a fall into fetid water, a broken limb, or worse. And yet he pressed on, for the city relied on him, even if it barely acknowledged his existence. The smell was constant, oppressive. Sewer water mingled with the stench of garbage, coal dust, and rotting food. Clothing became a second skin, caked in filth, impossible to wash completely. Faces blackened, hands blistered, hair stiffened with the grime of hours spent crawling through darkness. Yet for the rat catcher, this was normal. To survive, he had to endure what others could not, to persist where others fled. Rats were clever. They adapted, learning the layouts of homes, the rhythms of the streets, the patterns of traps. Some seemed almost human in cunning, avoiding snares and poisons, multiplying faster than the hunter could cull them. Entire households could fall victim to infestations before the rat catcher arrived, each call a race against time. And sometimes, even his best efforts failed. The vermin returned, undeterred, and the work restarted with the same grim cadence. Yet the hunt was not purely solitary. Dogs, trained to scent and flush, accompanied him through the alleys and sewers. Their instincts guided traps, alerted to hidden nests, and offered a measure of protection. Even so, they were not perfect allies. A misstep could see the animal lost to the darkness, bitten, or pulled into refuse-laden water. The rat catcher carried responsibility not only for the vermin caught, but for the lives of those who assisted him, animal and human alike. Night was often when his work intensified. Vermin moved more freely under cover of darkness, when markets were empty and households asleep. He crept through streets, lanterns in hand, the glow flickering over walls and fences as he checked traps and laid new ones. The quiet was deceptive. Every scuttle of feet, every rustle of fur could signify success or failure. Vigilance was constant. Pause meant lost hours, lost vermin, and increased danger to the city. Seasonal changes brought different challenges. Summer bred swarms of young rats, multiplying faster than ever. Winter drove them into attics and cellars, closer to human warmth, increasing the risk of disease. Flooded streets and overflowing sewers displaced nests, sending vermin streaming into homes and shops. The rat-catcher's schedule never slowed. He adapted, following the creatures, anticipating movement, preempting disaster where he could. Despite the danger, the work demanded a strange intimacy with death and decay. Every caught rat had to be disposed of, some buried, others boiled, some presented as proof of labour. Children and apprentices watched, learning to handle bodies without flinching, to understand that survival sometimes required hands-on confrontation with life and death alike. It was a harsh education, forging endurance, courage, and the ability to look upon misery without collapsing. The city itself shaped him as much as he shaped it. Narrow streets, crumbling buildings, overflowing gutters, and hidden tunnels became the framework of his life. He moved as if part of the infrastructure, a shadow threading through the city's underbelly. The stench clung to him. The vermin followed patterns he memorized. The weight of responsibility pressed upon him. Sleep was precious, fleeting, often broken by the need to respond to sudden infestations or emergency calls from households desperate to avoid ruin. Socially, he was invisible. Respect was rare, fear more common. People tolerated him, sometimes recoiled, sometimes whispered rumours of curses or strange knowledge, but never offered thanks. And yet, the city's survival depended on his labour. Food storage remained viable, disease vectors were limited, homes were kept livable. Invisible, uncelebrated, necessary, he existed at the edge of society, his life defined by service to a city that barely noticed him. Over time, he learned patience in ways no other labourer could. The hunt was unending, the vermin unyielding. One success was always temporary, one triumph fleeting. Yet endurance became his defining measure. Strength alone was insufficient. Cleverness, observation, timing, and the ability to endure discomfort and danger were essential. Life itself became a constant negotiation with darkness and pestilence, with the knowledge that the work would never truly end. When the city slept, he continued, a lantern swaying in alleys, footsteps silent, hands steady. Rats moved beneath floors, across rafters, inside walls, yet he pursued them, guided by instinct, experience, and grim necessity. Dawn would eventually chase him back into daylight, into recognition or scorn, but the vermin never ceased. They were eternal, and so, in a sense, was he, caught in the unbroken cycle of predator and prey, survival and filth, service and invisibility. The rat-catcher's life was measured not in comfort or rest, but in persistence. He endured disease, stench, bites, exhaustion, and public neglect. He learned to anticipate every shadow, to recognize every faint sound, to move with the quiet rhythm of predators and prey intertwined. And though invisible to the world above, he shaped its very survival, guarding against chaos, ensuring that commerce and domestic life could continue despite the constant threat below. In the endless hunt, he became part of the city itself, a figure whose labour, though unseen, was as essential as fire, coal, or salt. His hands carried disease and relief. His eyes scanned shadows others ignored. His body endured what few could imagine. And when he finally rested, it was only for a brief moment, for the vermin never slept, the city never ceased, and his unending hunt awaited with the turning of every alley, every floorboard, every hidden corridor where rats scurried and life clung to the fragile edge of survival. Even after the rat-catcher had disappeared into the shadows of winding alleys, the city's relentless rhythm pressed on, and where vermin scuttled and disease lingered, another layer of labour was already at work, one that combined heat, stench, and the constant threat of chemical burns. Soap, a substance that today seems benign, clean, even comforting, was once the product of grueling toil. Behind the gleaming bars that polished household floors, scrubbed garments, and softened skin lay the labour of soap boilers, men and women whose lives were a continuous negotiation with fire, lye, and molten fat. The buildings were low, squat, and often windowless, designed not for comfort, but to contain the smell that would otherwise seep into the streets. Inside, cauldrons the size of barrels roared with heat, their contents bubbling and spitting as animal fats mixed with harsh alkali. Steam rose like a living thing, dense and suffocating, clinging to every surface, curling into the lungs of those who worked there. Temperatures were high enough to burn skin through clothing, and yet the labour demanded prolonged exposure, hours spent stirring, pouring, and shaping substances that could scar, blister, and corrode with careless contact. Fat was the base of every batch, and sourcing it was a story in itself. Slaughterhouses supplied tallow from animals recently dead, often mixed with the remnants of grease collected from kitchens and markets. It arrived in lumpy, cold blocks that had to be rendered slowly over the fire, a process that required constant attention. Miscalculate, and the cauldron could boil over, spilling molten fat across the floor and searing anyone who stood too close. The smell was unbearable: burned hair, rancid fat, smoke, and the sharp tang of alkali combined into a scent that clung to clothing, hair, and skin for days. The soap boiler's workday was long and unyielding. Fire had to be stoked continuously, cauldrons stirred with heavy wooden paddles, and batches monitored for consistency. Over time, the repetitive labour took its toll. Hands became raw from contact with the harsh ingredients, eyes red from steam and fumes, backs hunched from leaning over barrels for hours on end. Every muscle was taxed, every sense assaulted. There was no grace in the movement, only efficiency born of necessity, and the faint hope of survival until the end of the shift. Apprentices learned early that soap work was as much about endurance as technique. They carried hot fat, scrubbed vessels, cleaned spills, and occasionally endured burns to learn the limits of both the substance and their own skin. Children as young as 10 were employed in some workshops, small enough to stir the thickened mixture without tiring quickly, yet young enough to be scarred permanently by neglect or accident. They emerged from their first weeks blackened with soot and grease, eyes watering, lips dry and cracked. Their education was harsh, physical, immediate, an unspoken lesson that the city demanded sacrifice in exchange for subsistence. Illness hovered constantly. Steam thickened with lye could scar lungs, leading to chronic coughing or infection. Accidental ingestion of alkali could erode throats and stomachs. Fat carried bacteria if improperly rendered, leading to fevers, boils, and other infections. Cuts and burns were normal, infections expected. Few treatments were available. Many workers carried the marks of their labour for life: scars along arms, hands twisted from repetitive strain, skin permanently thickened or blistered. Survival required resilience that was as mental as it was physical. The work was socially isolating. The buildings themselves emitted stench so strong that neighbours often avoided them, and workers returned home coated in odours that made their presence unwelcome in modest households. Meals were eaten quickly, clothing never fully clean, and sleep often disturbed by nightmares of boiling fat, scalding cauldrons, and fires unchecked. Society depended on their labour, yet refused to acknowledge it, creating a paradox of necessity and invisibility that defined every day. Soap boilers were intimately acquainted with fire. Furnaces had to burn consistently. Cauldrons had to maintain precise temperatures. Too hot, and the batch ruined itself and anyone nearby, too cold, and it became useless. Constant vigilance was required. Sparks leapt from stoves, wooden paddles could ignite in careless proximity, and fumes accumulated until ventilation became a matter of survival. Even a small lapse could result in disaster. Fire, fat, and alkali combined to form an environment that punished any distraction, any moment of weakness. Yet even amidst danger, efficiency was paramount. Every batch of soap was precious. Families depended on its cleaning power, markets relied on it for trade, and workshops lived or died by the quality of their product. Workers learned to control both chaos and discomfort, to move with a rhythm that balanced heat, weight, and timing. The cauldrons demanded respect, not only for their physical presence, but for the precision they required. Inattention could cost a hand, a life, or the sustenance of the household. Apprentices, despite the cruelty of early exposure, eventually developed a strange rhythm with their environment. They learned to gauge temperature by sight and touch, to anticipate splashes and bubbles, to move their bodies in ways that minimized exposure while maximizing output. It was a dance of endurance, repetition, and intuition, a survival strategy that slowly honed their resilience, but at an enormous cost to comfort, health, and often childhood itself. Fat, once rendered, had to be poured into moulds, cut, stamped, and left to cure. Every movement exposed the worker to heat. Every motion was repeated hundreds of times per day. Floors became slick with residual fat. Burns were common from sudden contact with hot surfaces. Steam condensed on the walls and ceiling, dripping constantly and carrying the scent of rancid tallow and harsh lye. Workers were soaked, sticky and fatigued, yet the work had to continue until every batch was completed. Poison and disease were constant companions. Unwashed fats carried bacteria. Lye could erode flesh if handled carelessly. The cauldrons could explode if improperly managed. The risk of fire spreading beyond the workshop was ever present, and a single accident could destroy property, livelihoods, or life itself. Soap boilers, surrounded by peril at every step, endured with quiet, stoic determination, moving as shadows within the glowing, roiling heat of their trade. Beyond the physical demands, the work exacted a psychological toll. Days blurred together in heat and smoke, weeks stretched into months of monotonous labour, punctuated only by the occasional accident or outbreak of illness. There was no distinction between home and work. The smell followed, the burns marked skin, the exhaustion carried over from day to day. Men and women became defined by the cauldrons, by the heat, by the chemical dance of alkali and fat that dictated their existence. Families depended on the wages of every boiler, and yet those wages were meagre. Every accident, every illness threatened survival. Children learned to contribute, adding to the labour but also inheriting the scars of the trade. Generations of workers became blackened with soot, skin scarred, lungs filled with fumes, yet the city would not pause for their suffering. Soap, clean and white, was the product of their endurance, an unacknowledged testament to human resilience amid filth, heat, and relentless labour. Even at night, when fires burned low and cauldrons cooled slightly, the smell lingered. Clothing dried stiff with fat and lye, skin retained the faint tingle of chemical burns, and eyes watered from steam inhaled hours earlier. The city slept above, unaware of the inferno contained within walls that produced the very substance it relied upon. Soap cleaned hands that had never known safety, scrubbed garments of people who had never endured what it took to create, and polished floors never tread by those who had carried the burden of heat and chemical exposure from dawn to dusk. Thus life continued, as relentless as ever. Cauldrons roared, Apprentices learned endurance and precision through trial and pain, and every worker bore the blackened, blistered evidence of the labour required to create what society demanded. The soap was clean, white and essential. The labourers behind it were not. They were shadows in heat and steam, sweat mingling with chemical residue, muscles screaming under strain, lungs blackened with fumes, skin scorched, yet surviving, because necessity brooked no delay. In the heart of every city, amid smoke, vermin, refuse, and fire, the soap boilers persisted. They were unseen, almost unremembered, yet they shaped daily life for all above. Their hands, hardened and scarred, their lungs, filled with acrid steam, their backs, bent from the repeated motion of stirring, were instruments of a society that demanded cleanliness, yet ignored the cost of its creation. And as they laboured, the city, oblivious, carried on, soothed by the very substance wrought from the fire and toil of those who would never rest in peace. Even as the city above struggled with fire, ash and smoke, and the claustrophobic spaces of soap houses exhaled their pungent fumes, there existed another world entirely, shaped by water, iron, and the unending, back-breaking rhythm of human muscle. It was a world where the body became an instrument, a tool chained to the will of captains and the relentless demands of war, trade, and empire. The galley rowers, those condemned to the oars, knew labour in its most extreme, exhausting, and dehumanising form. The ships were long, narrow, and designed for speed and manoeuvre rather than comfort. The decks pitched sharply with every swell of the sea, and below, benches stretched from stem to stern, each occupied by men whose lives were governed by the sweep of the oar and the lash of the overseer. Shackles bound some, others were pressed into service by poverty or punishment. Escape was impossible, for the sea itself was as much a prison as the iron that encircled their ankles and wrists. Dawn found them already at the oars, the horizon barely lightened, muscles stiff from the cold of night and the soreness of the previous day. Their hands were raw from rope and wood, backs stiff and strained, eyes fixed on the rhythm demanded by the captain's shout or the drumbeat that echoed across the deck. There was no relief, no pause, only the unceasing pull of oars through water, each stroke a repetition of suffering, a testament to endurance and submission. The conditions were brutal. Salt water sprayed into open wounds, stinging and burning. Sun reflected off the sea, bleaching skin and cracking lips. Wind tore through a tattered clothing, chilling bodies wet from labour or rain. Below deck, heat could become unbearable, the air thick with moisture, and the stench of human sweat, urine, and fatigue. The galley was a furnace, a crucible of endurance that tested lungs, muscles, and willpower to their absolute limit. Food was scarce and of poor quality. Hard biscuits, brackish water, and occasional scraps of salted meat sustained life, but never comforted it. Hunger gnawed alongside exhaustion, adding its own slow burning misery to every hour of labour. Illness thrived in the crowded wet conditions. Dysentery, scurvy, and infections claimed bodies almost as surely as the lash or the sea. Medical care was rudimentary, often cruelly applied, and survival required both luck and resilience in equal measure. The rowers themselves were a mix of social cast-offs, prisoners of war, criminals, debtors, or the desperately poor who had nothing else to offer. Each man was shackled by circumstance, bound by necessity, and rendered nearly anonymous by the collective suffering of the bench. Their identities faded beneath sweat, salt, and toil. Individuality was a luxury. Survival demanded assimilation into the rhythm of the ship, into the chorus of bodies pulling in unison through the merciless sea. Pain was constant. Hands blistered against rough wood, fingers split, and bleeding, backs arched unnaturally for hours, spines groaning under repeated strain. Legs cramped, joints stiffened, muscles burned, and yet the oar demanded continuous motion. There were moments when a man faltered, slipped, or lost grip, overseen not with mercy, but with the immediate lash of a whip, the bark of a captain, or the shoving of a comrade forced to keep pace. Weakness could be fatal, both in terms of immediate punishment and the danger posed to the ship's manoeuvrability. The rhythm of labour was merciless. Stroke followed stroke with the constancy of tide and wind. There was no variation, no relief. Each pull of the oar was an exercise in endurance, a negotiation with pain, a test of mental fortitude as much as physical. The sea amplified every misstep, the rocking decks, the shifting weight of water-laden vessels, the spray that turned benches into slick obstacles. Even those who survived one voyage were often broken in body or spirit, carrying scars, arthritis or deformities long after the ship docked. Sleep was stolen, brief, and often on the deck itself. Men curled where space allowed, muscles still quivering from effort, backs stiff from unnatural positions, lungs tasting the brine of the sea, skin sunburned or salt-encrusted. Dreams were haunted by oars, waves, and the lash, by the relentless expectation of motion and obedience. Night offered little comfort. Storms, enemy ships, and the unpredictable swell of the sea ensured vigilance, turning rest into a tense endurance of body and mind. The galley itself was a social hierarchy of cruelty. Captains and overseers, often untrained in mercy, commanded with an iron fist. Discipline was instant and harsh, often public, meant to instill fear and maintain rhythm. Failure to obey, to maintain stroke, or even to move quickly enough could lead to flogging, chaining, or being thrown into the sea for all to see. Authority was absolute. Submission was not negotiable. Yet survival demanded adaptation. Men learned to pace themselves, to conserve energy without appearing weak, to synchronize with the collective movement of the bench. Small innovations, slight adjustments in grip, shifts in stance, subtle coordination with neighbours, allowed endurance to stretch hours into days, and days into weeks. It was a brutal education in endurance, obedience, and the merciless calculation of effort against necessity. Illness compounded misery. Scurvy, from vitamin-deficient rations, led to bleeding gums and weakened joints. Dysentery flowed through ranks, incapacitating men while others were forced to pull double. Fatigue and exposure weakened bodies already worn by labour. Mortality was high. Life expectancy was measured in months rather than years for those pressed into service. Each voyage was a gamble, each stroke a negotiation with fate itself. Families rarely saw the rowers. Letters were infrequent, wages minimal or non-existent. Society above the deck treated them as tools, commodities, expendable units of labour necessary for conquest, trade, or punishment. Their humanity was submerged beneath shackles, salt, and sweat. They existed in a space between life and oblivion, defined entirely by the unbroken repetition of motion and the endurance of misery. The sea itself became a constant opponent. Storms magnified every difficulty. Waves threatened to overturn. Decks became slick with rain. Water seeped into every crevice, soaking clothing and chilling bones. Yet still, the oars moved, driven by the necessity of survival and the absolute command of authority. Men learned to anticipate the sea's fury, to adjust timing, to lean against its pull, to keep rhythm when chaos reigned. Mastery was partial, temporary, and never complete. Each landing at port offered little relief. Some men were sold, others pressed into new service. Some received paltry rations, few comforts, and brief respite before being returned to the oars. Even when land brought freedom from chains, it rarely offered safety, comfort, or rest. Bodies had been pushed to limits, minds conditioned to obey, spirits dulled by months of relentless rhythm and exposure. The experience left scars that were visible and invisible, physical and psychological, marking a life permanently altered by the demands of the galley. There were occasional moments of camaraderie among the rowers, small exchanges of humour, silent coordination in difficult weather, shared endurance of punishment, all became survival strategies. Yet these moments were fleeting, overshadowed by exhaustion, discipline, and the ever-present demands of the bench. Every day was an echo of the last, and the labour was ceaseless, stretching beyond the horizon, over water, and under the authority of men who had no understanding of mercy. And yet the city, empire, and trade thrived because of them. Ships moved, goods travelled, wars were fought, commerce continued, all powered by muscles chained to wood and oar. Invisible above deck, forgotten below, galley rowers were the engines of history, their suffering hidden beneath the rhythm of waves and the hammering of iron. Their lives were endurance made flesh, a testament to what the human body could endure under absolute necessity. As the sun rose and fell, as storms came and went, as the rhythm continued, the galley rowers persisted. Shackled, scorched, soaked, and exhausted, they lived lives defined by motion, survival, and the endless echoes of iron against water. They were ghosts in the tide, instruments of power, instruments of survival, instruments of a city and a world that demanded their labour without acknowledgement. And in their endless motion, the human capacity for endurance became as tangible as the water that surrounded them, as cruel as the lash, as unforgiving as the sea itself. Even as the oars of galleys cut through the restless sea, the city remained an empire of darkness and decay. Streets choked with refuse, alleys thick with filth, and markets slick with waste created a landscape where survival was as much about avoidance as it was about endurance. And it was here, in the shadowed arteries of urban life, that the silent sweepers performed their grim work. They were the forgotten guardians against catastrophe, men and women whose labour was relentless, invisible, and fatal at its edges. The plague years had reshaped the city into a living organism of disease and despair. Bodies fell where they stood, unattended, sometimes weeks before removal. The dead, half buried in hastily dug pits, half cast into streets and rivers, became breeding grounds for sickness. And yet, daily life demanded that someone walk these streets, that someone sweep away the ash, the refuse, the decay, so the city above could continue. The silent sweepers took up the tools of survival, brooms, shovels, baskets, and sacks, moving through streets where shadow and stench were as palpable as stone and wood. Their days began before sunrise, when mist hovered over cobblestones and smoke from distant fires blurred the edges of buildings. The air was heavy, damp, scented with soot, ash, and human suffering. Their hands became instruments of grim necessity, sweeping away remnants of fire, dumping heaps of debris into carts, washing streets with brine or water as the season allowed. It was a labour of invisibility, every movement necessary, every task urgent, yet largely unobserved except by those unfortunate enough to witness it. Plague was ever present. The sweepers inhaled dust laced with the remnants of disease, touched surfaces that had hosted it, worked amidst the whispers of death lingering in the air. Protective measures were rudimentary, cloth masks, simple gloves, or nothing at all. Each inhale carried risk. Each sweep of the broom brought contact with contagion. Many succumbed quickly, often within days of exposure, leaving the work to the next desperate soul who had no choice but to take their place. The streets themselves were obstacles. Ash from burnt homes mixed with human and animal waste, turning alleys into slick, treacherous paths. Piles of rubbish could hide both danger and disease. Broken glass, sharp metal, rotting food, the occasional corpse. Navigating these hazards required constant attention, agility and acceptance that injury was inevitable. Blisters, cuts, burns from fires still smouldering, and bruises became the uniform of the sweepers. Pain was not incidental. It was a constant companion, woven into every movement, every push of the broom, every bend to the ground. Children, like in so many other trades, were pressed into service. Small hands reached into corners unreachable by adults, lifted baskets that would crush others, and endured the stench that seared lungs and eyes. They learned quickly that speed was life, and that hesitation could mean death, either by disease or by accident, in streets cluttered with hazards. Apprentices became hardened beyond their years, their bodies bearing early scars, their minds trained to suppress fear, nausea, and revulsion. Heat of summer brought its own agony. The stench of decaying refuse intensified, flies swarmed in thick clouds, and sun-baked streets until they radiated heat back at the sweepers. Winter was no respite. Freezing rain turned streets into slick mirrors, snow hid dangers beneath an innocent facade, and water froze in baskets and shovels, making labour heavier and more exhausting. Endurance, both physical and mental, became the defining characteristic of anyone who survived more than a few weeks in this work. The sweepers had no recognition, no applause. Only the sight of cleaner streets marked their passage, a faint tribute that disappeared within hours. The city needed them, yet it barely noticed, and when it did, it often recoiled. Families avoided them, houses barred doors and windows, and those fortunate enough to avoid disease whispered curses or pity. Yet the sweepers moved onward, uncelebrated, unremembered, driven by the unrelenting necessity of survival, by the faint hope that cleaning the streets would save more lives than it cost their own. Illness was constant and indiscriminate. The plague struck without warning, often invisible until it was too late. Coughs became fevers, pustules erupted, and death could claim a sweeper within days. The physical toil weakened bodies, making them susceptible to infection. Exposure ensured they were vectors as much as victims. The work demanded courage, but survival often hinged on luck, distance from contaminated surfaces, and the ability to push the body beyond exhaustion without collapsing. There was danger beyond disease. Streets were not empty. Thieves, drunks, and desperate survivors roamed alongside them. Heaps of burning ash could flare unpredictably. Carts of refuse tipped, and accidents were common. Sweepers learned to move with a combination of caution and speed, reading the city as an organism, its currents, dangers and rhythms, to avoid being consumed by the very streets they laboured to maintain. Psychological strain was pervasive. Constant exposure to death, decay, and disease desensitized some, drove others to despair. The work demanded mental resilience, to sweep away what others had left behind without flinching, to ignore stench that made stomachs revolt, to continue when hope seemed impossible. Many who survived the first months were hardened, unyielding, and almost inhuman in their capacity to endure what would break ordinary men and women. The sweepers were part of a chain as old as cities themselves. Fires that required ashes to be cleared, waste that demanded disposal, streets that could not function without maintenance. These formed an ecosystem of labour where every task fed into the next. Sweepers cleaned what the fire and filth left behind, just as coal heavers, soap boilers, and galley rowers had cleared or contributed to other layers of human toil. Their work was at the confluence of danger, disease, and invisibility, bridging the gap between survival and catastrophe for the city at large. At dawn, when the light barely touched the rooftops, sweepers were already on the move. Brooms scraped cobblestones, dust and ash swirled in the morning air, carts rattled over uneven stones, and the sound of labour was the only acknowledgement of human presence in streets half empty, half choked with remnants of death. There was rhythm here, too, a cadence born of necessity, of repetition, of endurance. One push after another, one sweep after another, until the streets were clear enough for life to continue above, if only temporarily. Even when the plague receded, sweepers endured. Residual filth, burnt homes, rotting refuse, and the ever-present threat of disease ensured that labour never truly ceased. Each day brought new debris, new danger, new exposure. Bodies aged quickly, skin weathered, lungs weakened, muscles constantly taxed. The work was relentless, cyclical, and invisible, carried out by men and women who understood that their survival depended on persistence, skill, and the ability to ignore the suffering around them while performing the labour that kept life above possible. Socially, they were isolated. Respect was rare, fear common. Children born into the trade often became the next generation of sweepers, inheriting skill, endurance, and exposure. Families depended on their wages, yet society scorned them, avoided them, whispered about their work as if proximity to disease defined moral character. Despite invisibility and scorn, their labour was indispensable. Streets functioned, commerce continued, and the city endured, though its survival rested on the backs of those who carried disease, ash, and death as a routine burden. And so, the sweepers laboured, silently, endlessly, through smoke, ash, plague, and stench. The city above moved on, oblivious, carrying on commerce, trade, and daily life, unaware that its survival rested on the rhythm of brooms scraping cobblestones, the lifting of ash-laden carts, the careful disposal of refuse that could have ended countless lives if ignored. They were invisible guardians, uncelebrated, but necessary beyond measure. In their hands, in their muscles, in their lungs, the city's survival was etched, a story written in sweat, exhaustion, and risk. Ash and dust, disease and decay became the tools and markers of endurance. Each day they emerged at dawn, each day they bent to their work, each day they survived a little longer than the last, carrying the silent weight of the plague, years on shoulders that would rarely be remembered. The sweepers were ghosts in the streets, shadows brushing against walls, hands blackened by ash, lungs filled with dust, hearts heavy with knowledge of mortality. Yet for all the horror and exhaustion, life above depended on them. The streets were clean enough to function, houses habitable enough to endure, markets passable enough to sustain trade. And as dawn turned to day, and day to dusk, the sweepers persisted, invisible, uncelebrated, and utterly essential, a testament to the unacknowledged endurance that history often demands. And so, as our journey through the shadows of history draws to a close, we are left standing quietly at the edge of lives that few dared to imagine. Hands raw from labour, lungs heavy with ash, sweat, and salt, bodies pushed to their limits in the relentless grind of survival. These were the men and women who laboured in silence, invisible yet utterly indispensable. They carved graves beneath the stones, hauled refuse through the plague-choked streets, pulled at oars until the rhythm of their suffering became indistinguishable from the pulse of the sea itself. We walked through smoke, mud and rot, through sweat-stung eyes, blistered hands and aching backs. We saw lives measured not in years or achievements, but in the repetition of motion, in the constant negotiation between endurance and oblivion. In every corner of history, there existed work so unforgiving, so grueling, that it demanded not just the body, but the surrender of spirit just to survive from one day to the next. And now, I want to ask you, what do you think? Which of these roles struck you the most? Which life, of all the lives we glimpsed tonight, would you find impossible to endure? Did the silent sweepers haunt your imagination? Or did the relentless galley rowers echo in your mind as they pulled against tides and fate alike? Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me which labourer's story lingered with you the longest, and if you felt, even for a moment, the weight of the world pressing down as it did upon them. History is full of stories that are rarely told, labour that is almost entirely forgotten. And yet, it is these lives, these silent, grueling, uncelebrated efforts that shape the world we inherit. Their sweat, their suffering, and their endurance were the foundations upon which empires, cities, and civilizations were built. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let these echoes of toil remind you. We live in a world built on the invisible labour of the past, a world shaped by hands that the history books often fail to name. If tonight's journey into the worst jobs in history captivated you, if you found yourself imagining the weight of the spade, the pull of the oar, the endless sweep of ash through plague-choked streets, then there's more waiting for you. More shadows, more stories, more truths that history hides in its quiet corners. Subscribe to the channel so you can continue walking these forgotten paths with us. Hit the bell, stay close, and let the stories of the unseen shape the way you see the world. And remember, every like, every comment, every share is a small light, letting others discover these forgotten lives, these uncelebrated labours, these echoes from beneath the stones, beneath the smoke, and beneath the tides. Thank you for walking quietly with me tonight through history's darkest and most demanding corners. Rest easy, but carry their endurance with you, at least in thought, until the next story begins.